Hello, folks, and welcome back to another episode of CryptX. I'm joined by my co-host CJ Reichel. Hope everyone is having a great start to the week. Lots to discuss, lots of price action over the weekend that's worth talking about. So thank you for joining us today. Can't wait to dive into things. But before we get started, CJ, how are you doing, my friend?
Doing well, Monty. Obviously, the Fed meeting Wednesday will be important for markets. Little bit of bearish price action in the major equities today, but excited to get into that and some more. But how are you doing?
I'm doing well, CJ. I'm doing well, and pretty excited to talk about some of the assets today. Some things I want to cover briefly are just Bitcoin and ETH, a brief overview of where they're at right now and where I think they might be headed. And then I want to talk about some altcoins as well that saw some massive liquidations over the weekend and saw some tremendous price action. That includes assets like Dash and Zcash. I want to take a look at those because those are moving and ultimately just kind of give you guys an idea of where I'm going to be putting my money this week and what I'm kind of going to be keeping my eye on. So without further ado, let's jump into Bitcoin. So Bitcoin's in a bullish to neutral consolidation period here. One thing that's really been encouraging and a lot of people have been talking about is this 85K price floor. You can see very strong supply absorption below this level. We talked about this a little bit last week and how this was a sign that we could see an interim reversal. And of course, we did end up getting that following this bullish engulfing candle. Price has been in this bullish to neutral consolidation. And I think we can go a little bit higher, touch the moving average. And once we do, this is going to be a very critical level here, right around 95,000. So as you can see, we're getting pretty close to that level. The moving average is coming down to meet price. If we break above that level, I actually don't mind taking a long position here. I like what I'm seeing from the RSI. It's turning up after an extended period of kind of negative divergences, down, 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 as price is going down, bottomed out on this day of big volume, and has since started to climb back up. So I'm going to be watching this 95K level very closely, and this is going to be kind of like a trigger for entry for me. If I see Bitcoin's price in the next week here get above 95K, straighten this out, break above this level, I like getting long here. So that's kind of like what I'm looking at for Bitcoin. Now, will we get above this level? It's going to be tough to say. One thing that's worth noting, and CJ, I think you'll find this pretty interesting, but I'm sure you saw this, Nod shared this with us, is currently Bitcoin held by ETFs and public companies actually hold more Bitcoin for the first time ever than exchanges. So that tells me a lot about the dynamic of this market, right? It tells me where the participation is coming from. And this tells me that if we are going to see an increase in price, it's not going to come from retail speculation on exchanges. It's going to come from institutions and public companies buying up Bitcoin and putting it on their balance sheet. And for the first time ever, we have more privately held Bitcoin than publicly available Bitcoin on exchanges. So that, to me, whenever you have that institutional demand, that is the bedrock for later retail demand. So we need to have institutions coming in, buying Bitcoin. It's encouraging to see that ETFs and public companies now hold more than what we're seeing on exchanges. That just creates further supply shock, and also it kind of creates a demand floor. Those companies aren't going to be selling Bitcoin anytime soon. Most of them are putting it on their balance sheet for the long term. So you can look at those those public companies and ETFs as long-term holders of Bitcoin. So now that we're seeing massive inflows into those ETFs and into that kind of institutional section of Bitcoin, I think that that is a good precursor to later retail demand and ultimately later all-time highs. So right now, it's encouraging at this price level, and I think a lot of it occurred when we dipped below 85,000, but institutions are stepping in and really setting a price floor for Bitcoin, and I think that that sets around 85,000 as it stands.
That's a very interesting point of data metric. It reminds me to ask you a question. Do you think that because a lot of the coins are now being held in ETFs, that kind of makes it a little bit more difficult to interpret on-chain data such as Glassnode? Can we not really rely on that type of data in like now because
Yeah, I think it's contingent on market, like the market cycle timing. I think right now, where we have so much institutional and ETF participation, you don't necessarily need to look on chain to tell what's going to happen because we have these massive institutions stepping in and buying Bitcoin. But later in the market cycle, when we have more retail participation and more like short term speculators to talk about, I think on chain data will become important again. But in the meantime, I think at this point in the market cycle, the most important thing is looking at that accumulation from ETFs and from institutions because that, like I said, kind of sets a price floor for Bitcoin in the interim here. And it seems like anything below 85K, we see an uptick in that institutional demand, which is very positive.
Yeah, that's very interesting points. I'd like to talk about the probability of like rate cuts and like what we're seeing kind of in not only currencies, gold and silver, but like the macro overview as we approach the Fed
Yeah,
meeting on Wednesday. Because
definitely worth talking about.
yeah, I've been looking forward to um, really going over this or really just watching how the market reacts to the rate cut. Will it do, what is expected, where, you get a bullish reaction from a 25 basis point cut, which now has a 90% probability of occurring, or does the dollar, continue to be weak? Um, this goes back, to the DXY. As you can see, when we forecasted out from previous cycle lows in 2014, 2018, and 2022, we're pretty on track and then kind of obviously have sold off into those rate cuts. But now we're at kind of the lower levels of where we've seen those historical cycles bottom, in our previous midterm election years. When we also look at the CCI in terms of other currencies, the dollar, I believe, still has a lot of crowded shorts. And we are seeing that CCI turn up from oversold levels. Interestingly, we are also seeing the major indices, which are the most sensitive to rate cuts, being IWM and the Dow. They rallied, right? They rallied into rate cuts thus far. And now they're kind of doing the inverse of the dollar in terms of the CCI and somewhat turning over. We actually did get a new tool that I'm very excited about using. I was using this a lot over the weekend and included it in our weekly report. But this is our 7-point trading algorithm. It's the checklist that AJ has come up with, but now it has, the ability to just type in a stock, and then we have a quick and objective analysis of, the 5-point trading checklist. One example I have here is the dollar currency index ETF. We can see it's showing 5 bullish signals and no bearish signals. We're seeing the doji. This is of Friday's data. We have gaps, stochastics. So it's a much more objective and systematic way to really enter and exit trades, which I'm really looking forward to using because now my process can be fully automated essentially, and there will be no subjective interpretation necessarily. But I want to type in IWM and Dow and show you guys what we're looking at, because we are actually seeing 7 out of 7 bearish signals in IWM as well as the Dow, which I'm not here to create an opinion or to necessarily predict the market. I'm just looking for circumstances of, be robotic. What is it telling us to do? And it looks bearish right now based on technicals. When we look at, Diamond ETF, the Dow, it's nearly identical in terms of the technicals that we're seeing, basically 7 out of 7 in terms of bearish signals. So that's obviously something that we're going to watch for and definitely implement into our analysis going forward. When we look at Bitcoin and ETH in terms of that 7-point trading algorithm, they are like what Monty described earlier, pretty neutral for the most part, but grinding their way back towards the moving average, 200-day moving average at roughly, 100,000 is what we're seeing on Bitcoin right now. So overall, I'm really focused on Wednesday and looking to take longs in the dollar based on how price reacts if we get that 25 basis point rate cut, because that's kind of been my thesis or idea of the market. But who cares about my opinion? Like, what is the signals and the market telling us? I'm not here to trade my opinion. Like, I'm going to be wrong many, many times from in the future. So at the very least, let's learn how to be wrong and make money, or at the very least be wrong and not lose money. So some very interesting tools, and I had a lot of fun playing around with that this weekend.
Yeah, I love having that objective 7 point trading checklist, kind of just to plug in a ticker and see if it is meeting the criteria. But I have a quick question for you. I want to kind of combine the things you've been talking about. You said some of the major indices showing some bearish signals, and then also, of course, we have the Fed meeting on Wednesday. What is your kind of outlook for the major indices as we head into the Fed announcement, and that in conjunction with the 7 point trading checklist giving us bearish signals across the major indices? What are your kind of thoughts on where we might head on Wednesday?
It's a tough question. I mean, I
Yeah,
don't know a whole lot in terms of like predicting exactly. That's why I want to watch to see how things react to the news Wednesday. As we can see, everything's pretty much lined up bearish in terms of the major indices from a technical perspective, where you have, the risk off trade being the dollar is actually showing some bullish technicals. And a rate cut is traditionally something that should be bullish indices and bearish the dollar. And if that action is already priced in, like if we're pricing in rate cuts over the last 2 weeks with this recent rally, then perhaps that becomes a sell the news event. If we just keep rallying, then there's really nothing for me to do in terms of a trading process perspective. But let's say we gap down to start the day on Wednesday in the dollar and then rally back and close green, then that shows that the dollar's resilient, and those rate cuts were probably largely priced in. I've been showing this one chart a lot in terms of the last rate cut we had in September. The dollar sold off, for 2 or 3 weeks going into that rate cut, and that marked the low. The last one we had in the dollar. We've gone up ever since. So perhaps that happens again. That's ultimately what I'll be looking for. But if we don't get it, or if there's not a setup, then I'll just be waiting and enjoying the boredom of trading.
yeah, yeah. I think that's how you got to look at it. Um, okay, I want to dive into some altcoins real quick. Kind of the last thing I got to say today, but I do think these are some assets worth mentioning. I want to start out with Dash because this one is up about 14% today. But it's not up on any bullish news, anything crazy like that. What we saw was um, nearly $300 million worth of short liquidations occur at the bottom of this downtrend here, and price has subsequently spiked back up. Now, looking at this chart, right, you can see it's in a clearly descending formation here. I think we can possibly climb up to the moving average, hit the moving average, and then get rejected and head back down to the $45 level. So I'm going to be waiting for one more day of confirmation. If we do get a bullish candle tomorrow, I'll consider shorting this thing to the lows. But ultimately, I want to fade this move because it's not on the back of anything necessarily fundamental or technical. It's just short liquidations, and that isn't necessarily a sign of retail strength. But it does tell me that, we've seen it before. We saw it here. We saw it here as well. People try to get short, got squeezed out. Try to get short here, got squeezed out. But I think that if you wait until you get this sort of formation here, where you get a bullish engulfing candle followed by a bearish engulfing candle at the moving average, you can short this with comfort. So I'm going to look to short this one in the coming days here. I'll put out a trade insight if I do, but it's just one worth watching. And then also, this one I'm a little bit more bullish on, but it is running into resistance as we speak at the moving average, and that's Zcash. We've talked a lot about Zcash recently. It's been one of the best performing assets over the last few months. Now, this is much different than Dash because, as you can see, we're in a relatively sustained uptrend as privacy tokens were gaining in popularity. But since then, we've had some long liquidations that have driven us back down to the 326 level, and then ultimately climb back up here to the 434 level. So what I'll be looking for is something kind of similar to Bitcoin, is either a break above this moving average and an opportunity to long up to the previous swing high, or if we get rejected and we get a bearish engulfing candle, shorting this thing back down to the lows of about 305. So just keep an eye on these two assets. They're the biggest movers of the day, and I think that they have the possibility to make some pretty big moves in the coming weeks, because we're seeing these moves happen into a relatively neutral Bitcoin. So it's not like this is you know, just altcoin strength across the board. There's just a few altcoins that are showing signs of strength. And as a result, I kind of like the idea of shorting those altcoins when they hit the moving average, or longing them as they break above it. We'll wait to see what happens, but that's kind of just two assets that I'm watching very closely this week.
Yeah, if you guys didn't know, Zcash or Dash is also a privacy coin, and as well as Zcash. So that privacy meta has really been like leading the like charge in terms of like the narratives. And one thing that I think is always really interesting, Monty mentions this with the short liquidations, but we saw something very similar in terms of Zcash before the recent move. At the lows, you see the funding rates in the perpetual futures markets. We saw that there were a lot of shorts, and funding rates went very negative at the recent lows. And it's like so classic. It's like, all right, now that we've fallen 30-40% in a week, like now everybody wants to short. Come on. Really, like seriously. So I'll be looking for, and they're already neutral. So the funding rates, a lot of those shorts have been squeezed out in the short term. So I'm going to look for, a little bit of continued momentum. And if that momentum fails and we get a nice technical setup with the CCI turning down, we shorted Zcash earlier in the month as one of our trade insights, and I'm starting to look to do it again. There's also an interesting bet on Polymarket that I still believe has a 5% per 90% probability of occurring, which is, the bet will Zcash hit 1,000 by the end of December. And I think that's, pretty unlikely. Unless we get a nice move in Bitcoin up to like 100 or maybe 120,000, but we'll see.
Yeah, without Bitcoin strength, I don't have much conviction in any long trade in the alts right now. And Bitcoin dominance is kind of telling the same story. It's down today, but that's just the result of those two assets being up relatively big. But until we see a nice climb in Bitcoin dominance and starting to see a big drop off, I think that it's going to be tough for these alts to rally into a neutral to bearish Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the other thing that I want to just mention briefly before we wrap up here is that over the weekend we did put together a video. It's basically a step-by-step tutorial in order to move crypto to these various futures exchanges to be able to actually short or long stuff like Zcash or Dash with leverage, in the sense that we're basically replicating options. Yeah, definitely would encourage you guys to check that out if you're looking to trade these assets, because we tried to make it as simple as possible. I see we do have a couple questions from the Oracle in chat, so why don't we take those? Any opinions currently?
Yeah, so we got a bullish Harami in Bitcoin today. That's one of the points in the
stock's down.
Yeah, with stocks down. Yeah. That is an encouraging sign, and I think we could see a move to the moving average on the back of that bullish Harami. We will see. But what are your views on XRP? Do you have any thoughts on XRP right now, CJ?
It's at support, and that support's holding thus far. Pretty similar in terms of Bitcoin with the, why don't I just bring it up on the chart?
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily so much about my opinion as it is what the technicals are showing us. So we still have the 20-day moving average acting as resistance. Price is really, fighting that. We don't have a massively wide divergence from the moving average. It's basically in the middle of a range. So it's tough. It's tough. I would say neutral on this one. We're still just kind of chopping in a range. until we really get maybe some definitive market action following the rate cut. So I'm just going to have to do neutral. You know, we could go into the fundamentals in terms of a longer market discussion, but as of now, I would just say, neutral.
Yeah, from a technical perspective, it looks very neutral. I'd wait till we get a few more confirmation points to trade that one. Because I think that it's looking about 50-50. It could go either way. We got another question here. MicroStrategy could rally 40% here, 255, and it would still be a bearish chart. LOL, crazy. And yeah, that's a great point. It would still look bearish, and a 40% move in MicroStrategy, we've seen that happen pretty quickly in the past. But again, I think that's going to be very contingent on how Bitcoin performs. If Bitcoin performs well, you'll see MicroStrategy performing well, as long as the other crypto-related equities, including the miners like Riot and Mara. But with a bearish and neutral Bitcoin, it's going to be hard for those tickers to gain any real traction or any speculation, because long-term speculators are looking for Bitcoin to be in all-time highs to be taking long positions. And I think that until we get, more bullish price action out of Bitcoin, which could happen soon, we got the bullish Harami. Um, I think it's going to be pretty tough for a stock like MicroStrategy to move even 10% if we have bearish and neutral price action in Bitcoin. So all contingent on Bitcoin, but yeah, it's a great point. I mean, MicroStrategy is very oversold right now, in my opinion.
Yeah. But then again, you got the dollar, with some strength. So I'm not seeing a lot of high conviction trades here. But anyways, make sure you guys check out the 2-week free trial at CryptX, stickytrades.com/CryptX. And Monty, I'll leave you for any final words or questions.
Yeah, definitely check out that free trial. We're posting trade insights. CJ sends out a weekly newsletter on Sundays that's kind of recaps the market. We also have a member webinar tomorrow. That's strictly for the members. It's an hour long. We answer all your questions, anything you want to hit. We're more than happy to do some analysis if you just drop a ticker in the chat. So definitely check that out. You can check it out at stickytrades.com/CryptX. But that is all we got for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you again next week. Take care.